As most of you will realise, today is the 10th of November and tomorrow is the 11th. And the 11th is, of course, 103 years ago since the armistice was signed. And so my prayer today is a prayer for Remembrance Day. Shall we pray? Gracious God, on this day of remembering, remind us how much we owe to others and how much we owe to you. Teach us how fortunate we are to enjoy peace and how precious a gift that is. But speak also of the price that securing and maintaining peace can entail. The sacrifices so many have made to make it possible. The courage they have shown, the suffering they have endured, and the horrors they have seen. Help us to learn the lessons of the past, but also of the present, honouring all who have served in battle and continue to serve, by doing everything we can to promote peace, justice, and harmony, putting the good of others before our own, just as you, in Christ, gave your all. And in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, our special welcome today is to Elsie and David, and they are going to do a reflection for us. The intriguing title, still worth puzzling out, is The Length of the Chancellor's Foot. That's what brought so many people out today. I even Googled it and got not much further than what I've said. So thank you both very much for agreeing to do this, and we really look forward to what you have to say. And from this point till the end, Elsie and David will take over.
Well, I think I start. As Liz says, the title is The Length of the Chancellor's Foot, and I hope by the end you'll know why it's been called that. On many Sundays, we sing hymns and say prayers for justice. But what is justice? And more importantly, how is it to be found? The Bible has many references to justice. I'll just mention three of them. Amos, chapter 5, verse 15. It's written, hate evil and love good. Establish justice in the courts. And in verse 24, very well-known words, let justice flow on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing torrent. Also in Zechariah chapter 7, there's a passage, verse 9. These are the words of the Lord of hosts. Administer true justice. Show kindness and compassion to each other. Do nothing to oppress the widow or the fatherless, the resident alien or the poor. Do not plot evil against one another. In the New Testament, we have the parable in Luke chapter 18, verses 1 to 8, of the unjust judge. He told them a parable to show that they should keep on praying and never lose heart. In a certain city there was a judge who had no fear of God or respect for man. And in the same city there was a widow who kept coming before him to demand justice against her opponent. For a time he refused, but in the end he said to himself, although I have no fear of God or respect for man, yet this widow is so great a nuisance that I will give her justice before she wears me out with her persistence. The Lord said, you hear what the unjust judge says. Then will not God give justice to his chosen, to whom he listens patiently while they cry out day and night? I tell you, he will give them justice soon enough. In these passages from the Bible, there are explicit references to the administration of justice. And this is reflected in the Judicial Oath, which every judge in England must take before assuming office. The oath is to do right to all manner of people after the laws and usages of this realm, without fear or favour, affection or ill will. As you will see, the oath has 3 requirements: to do right to all people, and not, as be noted, justice. Secondly, in accordance with, as after, the laws and duties of the realm. Thirdly, to do so without fear or favour, affection or ill will. In England, for some 400 or 500 years, there were 2 separate systems of law administered in separate courts. There was the common law, administered in the common law courts, and equity, administered in the Court of Chancery. The common law was the earlier in point of time, and it arose as part of King Henry II's centralisation of royal power. His dates were 1154 to 1189. King Henry sent out his judges from London all over the country to decide legal disputes. They were instructed, in the words of the old Norman French, to oyer et determiner, that is, to hear and determine the cases which came before them. Following the Norman conquest, there had been no single system of law applicable to the whole country. What the judges found were local courts applying local laws and local customs. The king's judges began applying those local laws and customs which they thought were the best, and hence developed the common law, the law which was common or applicable to the whole country. The system of judges being sent out from London to the provinces became what was known as the assize system, and that continued, in fact, until 1972, when it was replaced by the Crown Court in criminal cases. Examples of the use of Norman French can still be seen in the words "Dieu et mon droit" in the Royal Coat of Arms, on the wall of the court under which the judge sits when hearing cases. The courts are still the Queen's courts, and the judges are the Queen's justices. Now, the common law had defects. Over time it became very technical, and because it was founded upon custom, it was not easily able to adapt to changes in society or to deal with new situations. Litigants, usually, I must say, those who had lost and who felt that justice had not been done, petitioned the king, who was the fount of all justice, for a remedy. The king would usually refer these petitions to his Lord Chancellor, and until the 16th century the Lord Chancellor was usually a cleric, and he was the king's spiritual advisor. He was the keeper of the king's conscience. The Lord Chancellor would determine the various petitions in accordance with his own conscience, and he would set aside those decisions of the courts which he considered unconscionable. Out of this developed the Court of Chancery, and the system of law applied by the Lord Chancellor became known as equity. A good instance of an area of law developed in Chancery is the law of trusts. At common law, if A gave property to B to be used for the benefit of C, B was the owner of the property, and he could deal with it as he pleased and could keep it for himself. In Chancery, however, it was thought to be unconscionable for B to disregard C's interests, and the Lord Chancellor would seek to protect C's rights. What was to happen if the 2 sets of courts should reach different conclusions? This was finally decided by King James I, following the conflict between the Court of the King's Bench and the Court of Chancery in the Earl of Oxford's case. King James decided that the Court of Chancery should prevail. This was confirmed by the Judicial Act of 1878, which abolished the separate common law and chancery courts and established a single court, now called the High Court, which was to apply both common law and equity, and where the principles of common law and of equity conflicted, equitable principles were to prevail. Now, the Earl of Oxford's case is an interesting one. It concerned the effect of the Ecclesiastic Leases Act of 1571. That act prohibited the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge from disposing of their lands for any greater term than 21 years or for a term of lives. Any disposition contrary to the act was to be absolutely void. Without complying with the Act, the Master and Fellows of Magdalen College, Cambridge, sold some land at Aldgate in the City of London to Queen Elizabeth, who sold it on to a merchant, and he in turn, in 1589, sold it to the Earl of Oxford, who built 130 houses on the land. In 1604, a new Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, brought proceedings in the Court of King's Bench to recover possession of the land, relying on the 1571 Act. At trial, the jury found in favour of the Earl of Oxford. But this verdict was held by the Court of King's Bench, presided over by Chief Justice Cook, to be wrong in law, and the possession order was made in favour of the college. The Earl of Oxford then started a new action in the Court of Chancery to prevent the college from enforcing the possession action. The Master of Magdalen College refused to answer the claim in Chancery or to appear in court. For his pains, he was committed by the Lord Chancellor to the Fleet Prison for contempt of court, and the Chancery action proceeded. The Lord Chancellor, who was then Lord Ellesmere, formerly Thomas Egerton, gave judgment in favour of the Earl of Oxford. And he began his judgment by referring to Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 30, quoting the words of Moses. A woman will be betrothed to you, but someone will ravish her. A man will build a house, but not live in it. You will plant a vineyard, but not enjoy its fruit. Now this passage appears in a long list of the woes which will befall a person if he or she does not obey the commandments of the Lord. The passage does not actually state that if you build a house, you should be able to live in it. The passage requires interpretation to reach that conclusion. Now, the justification for the interference by Chancery was that the decision of the Court of King's Bench was against conscience. Do you agree with that? Was this an early instance of cakeism by the college, seeking to have its cake and eating it? Having sold the land and received all the purchase money, it was seeking to get the land back without payment and with 130 houses on it. Originally, as I have said, the Lord Chancellors were clerics, deciding each case according to their conscience. From about the time of Cardinal Wolsey, the Lord Chancellors were generally lawyers. One thing lawyers do not like in the law is unpredictability. To decide a case in accordance with the judge's conscience was thought by many to be the negation of justice, because there is no standard by which it can be judged. Thus, in 1685, John Selden, a well-known lawyer and historian, said, "Equity is a roguish thing. For law we have a measure, know what to trust to. Equity is according to him that is Chancellor, and as that is larger or narrower, so inequity. 'Tis all one, as if they should make the standard we call a foot, a Chancellor's foot. What an uncertain measure would this be? One Chancellor has a long foot, another a short foot, another an indifferent foot. 'Tis the same thing in a Chancellor's conscience." The point is that justice should not be arbitrary or at the whim of the judge. Like cases should have a similar result. This view also took hold in the Court of Chancery. Thus, Lord Eldon, the Lord Chancellor, said in a case of G.N. Pritchard in 1818, "The doctrines of this court ought to be as well settled and made as uniform almost as those of common law, but taking care that they are to be applied according to the circumstances of each case. I cannot agree that the doctrines of this court are to be changed with any succeeding judge. Nothing would inflict on me greater pain in quitting this place than the recollection that I have done anything to justify the reproach that the equity of this court varies with the length of the Chancellor's foot." Now, Lord Eldon was Lord Chancellor for over 20 years. and it was under his chancellorship many criticisms were made of the difficulties and delays in obtaining justice in the Court of Chancery. To some extent, this was because there were only two judges in the court, the Lord Chancellor and the Master of the Rolls. But that was not the only problem, as Elsie will explain.
Well, into the middle of all this litigation came Charles John Huffam Dickens, novelist, journalist, and social critic. He had known poverty in his childhood. His father had been thrown into a debtor's prison, and when little more than a child, Charles had had to leave school and go out to work in a factory. He was able later to take up his education again and stayed at school until the age of 15. Among other occupations which he then took up was that of solicitor's clerk and also parliamentary reporter and law reporter. He therefore had some knowledge of the law, and he had a great scorn for it and for its lawyers. However, he would never walk away from a good story, and he found one to tell in the law reports. I have to say that the characters had nothing to do with the case, and in the book he created his own. But it was the judicial inadequacies and the court proceedings that he followed through to condemn. I don't think it's ever been seriously suggested that it was the legal reformer in Dickens which led to a change in the law. More often a substantial change, such as the Judicial Act of 1878, came from bad law recognized in poor judgments. But Dickens carried discontent and dispute into one of his classics, and you probably guessed by now that was Bleak House. This was published in 20 parts in the year between 1852 and 1853, and as a novel in 1853. So, by 1851, when Charles Dickens began writing the book, he was rich and successful. He was also a bit of a dandy. He liked to wear very brightly coloured embroidered jackets. He was cynical about the society of his time and its shortcomings. He did not lead campaigns, but he wrote books. He was an influential commentator. He was the conscience of his age. He knew well the ginnels and alleyways of London. He attacked social and inadequate institutions and what he called the moral evil of the workhouse. He would write a pamphlet on a topical issue. For instance, how the poor should be allowed to enjoy the Sabbath. He didn't say anything about the rich enjoying it. He toured America for 5 months as a renowned literary speaker. For the story of Bleak House, he exhibited his endless ability to create characters, and he had an ear for local speech, dialect, and humour. There are plots and subplots, as the case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce worked its way through the Court of Chancery. Ada Clare and Richard Carstone were 2 young wards of court placed in the care of John Jarndyce as they awaited the result of that case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, dragging its way through several generations. Miss Flight, the lovely character, was a hanger-on at the courts, unable to keep away from the drama, and who promises that she will set her caged birds free when the courts decide her case. Crook, a dealer in rubbish and rags, has the nickname the Lord Chancellor because he collects legal documents as well. and the great bailiff who walks the corridors was Death. The aristocracy was represented in Lady Dedlock, and one of the two narrators is her illegitimate daughter, the heroine of the book, Esther Summerson. It is the third-person narrator, unknown, who tells of the law and those times and condemns the so-called self-seeking legal system represented by Lord Eldon in Chancery. There are legal characters too. The devious Mr. Guppy, the law clerk, and Mr. Tulkington, the lawyer to Sir Leicester and Lady Dedlock, who was the first solicitor in English fiction to be murdered. By the time it looked as if the case might be resolved, it nearly dissolved. It petered out. Legal costs and fees had consumed the estate, and the moral is that the lawyers get paid first. The lesson to be learned by the lawyer is that justice delayed is justice denied. The legal dilemma is the forever one of the rule versus judicial discretion. The rule of law, in effect, requires the law to be knowable and the process accessible. We have to ask if the same issue is with us today. Equity procedure at that time, that is in the days of Lord Eldon, was a pleasant and leisurely pursuit for those with money and time. It was more flexible and less rule-bound than Queen's Bench, and certainly had a superior class of case. Complex contracts and trusts. The Lord Chancellor had one of the highest incomes in London. It is thought by many that Jarndyce and Jarndyce was inspired by the case of Thellisson and Woodford, and that was reported in 1799 in the Vesey Reports. This was a case involving English trust law, a lawsuit resulting from the will of Peter Thellisson, an English merchant and banker. Briefly, well, maybe not quite so briefly, but kind of briefly, he left estate to be divided among those of his grandchildren, his immediate descendants, who were alive when the last of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, alive at his death, had died. A brief thing is just to say, lives in being. The bequest was held valid, but this left undecided who was actually entitled to inherit the estate. This was not resolved until 1859, and by then the amount left after the court costs and legal expenses was not much more than the amount bequeathed 60 years earlier, £600,000. The testator had directed that until distribution, the income from the estate should be accumulated and added to capital. If that had actually happened, the amount to be distributed would have been about 1.4 million, or in today's money, 1.3 billion. 60 years is a long time. One final mention of Bleak House. On my first day as a law student, the Dean of the Law Faculty firmly stated to all of us students that there were 3 books which every prospective lawyer should have read. The first, Bleak House, of course, to appreciate the effect of the law's delays. The second, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, to understand the true nature of guilt. And thirdly, Through the Looking Glass. Lewis Carroll was not a lawyer, but this read was to help us aspire to use logical thought, leading to legal reasoning. So there we students were, with the assistance of Humpty Dumpty on words and the Red Queen on argument. No wonder Alice was so perplexed. David's references to the Chancellor's foot have made me recall a proposition put forward by some legal jurists in the United States, and that was some time ago. I should say here that one of the major gifts that the English left the Americans on leaving their shores was the common law. These jurists, and possibly a judge or two, suggested that judicial decisions were influenced by what the judge had for breakfast, thus replacing conscience with the digestive system. Frivolous, but it does remind us at the receiving end of justice that we need to be vigilant about bias. With the common law, however, we do have an appellate system allowing appeals to superior courts within the system. And in the case law, we have what has been called a protection, though some call it a deadlock, with binding precedent. Binding down from precedent to precedent. At the back of it all is the old joke that when a lawyer eventually becomes a judge, he or she dispenses with justice. But that's just a question of words, Humpty Dumpty would say. After all this, there is another form of justice. It has a name. One would think one that would appeal more to the man and woman in the street, and perhaps even the hymn writer. It is known as natural justice. It has a legal pedigree. It derives from Roman law, not the common law. Roman law is the basis for the civilian system in Scotland, and that's why I may not have referred to Scotland very much to date. Most of Europe, and also some other places. Natural justice is judicial, it relates to the forum, but it is more than procedural. What it states is that everyone is entitled to a fair hearing before a judge who is unbiased, and with the individual having the right to hear the allegations against him or her and the right to respond to them. It is used in quasi-judicial decisions, in tribunals, and in courts of law. There is an area where it could be said that English law is in conflict with the Convention, and that is jury trial. Well, no reasons are given. The first questions we asked were, what is justice, and where is it to be found? The answer we have suggested is that it can be found in history, in legislation, in case law. As to what it is, well, it is equity, equality, balance, predictability, impartiality, reasonableness, and what we all look for, fair play. Thank you for listening.